I am so delighted that we are beginning this new phase of Lucy Lecture, the Lucy Lecture, in making it happen as Zoom-based Lucy Lectures. And I have to say, Dr. Rendsburg, on a personal note, since we did meet back then in 2004, we were just talking about how we were both in Highland Park. I had arrived only recently, and you afterwards to Rutgers University. I have been wanting to take a class with you for, nearly 2 decades. Always missed my opportunity to ask if I could audit at Rutgers. The news of your arrival there was wonderful. And the news of your being our scholar this year is really a treat. And to know we are studying with a world-class professor and explorer of Jewish peoplehood and heritage and the way we've sanctified our existence. And this notion of going from the land of Israel through and outwardly to the world, and in textuality and with language and with exploration in that way with you, really helps us capture the kind of culture that we have a dedication to in our community at Or Zarua. We're continuing to explore the texts of our tradition and texts we don't know about yet. And I am sure that you have what to offer there. And as Zella just said, I was going to say too, I saw that you're on the great courses and you have more to offer. You're the Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies and History and Blanche and Irving Laurie Chair in Jewish History at Rutgers University, Premier Biblical Scholar, for sure, charismatic teacher, and Mensch. And we know about your community involvement as well. So I will just turn everyone to Mark Ashley's beautiful introduction of this series and Dr. Rendsburg in the newsletter, which Charlie just handed me right from the editor's hands, designer's hands, to highlight the next 2 that are coming. But without further ado, I want to turn it over to Dr. Rendsburg. Again, share excitement that you're here, and our Lucy Lecture series begins today, and we're delighted to have you from Provence, France.
Thank you, Rabbi Bolton. I don't know if we're on first name basis or going back and forth. Scott and I first met in 2004, as he mentioned, when we overlapped in Highland Park, New Jersey for a few years, and it's great to be back in contact, and also a real honor to be the speaker this year for the Lucy Davidovich series. I, like everybody else, probably have read her remarkable history of the Holocaust, the war against the Jews. We all read it in college. It's still, I think, the best there is. And my colleague, Nancy Sinkoff, as many of you know, Rutgers University Jewish Studies and History, has recently published an intellectual biography of the great Lucy Davidovich. So it's to have my name in any which way mentioned in the same breath as hers is a true honor. So thank you for hosting me. And hello, everybody on the Upper East Side and wherever else you may be. We are actually in Provence in the south of France on a 6-month academic sabbatical tour, divided almost equally between Israel, Provence, and Rome, which will be our next and final station. But for this Sunday and the next 2 Sundays, we'll be coming to you from this lovely home here in the south of France. And we've been exploring the rich Jewish medieval history and much, much more to be seen in the surrounding cities, Arles, Avignon, and so on. But we're going back much further in our first presentation, the people of the book, and everybody likes alliteration, correct? From Canaan to Cairo to La Coruña. We'll be doing Cairo next week and La Coruña in 2 weeks from now. The people of the book. Now, if I were home in my home office doing the Zoom lecture, you would see behind me a full bookcase of in my home study of all the books, and I see them all in in your library, where Rabbi Bolton is seated at the moment as well. And I want to remind you of the following. The book, we are the people of the book, but the book, as you and I know it, is an artifact of modernity. In fact, if I were at home, I would be holding up in my hand the Eitz Chaim volume used by so many conservative synagogues. And you walk into the synagogue and you sit down in the pew. And if it's like most congregations, in front of you is a Siddur and a Chumash, the Eitz Chaim volume. How did we get to that? In fact, in particular, the biblical text. How did we get this book? When I say it's an artifact of modernity, I want to remind you that the printed book was created only in the middle of the 15th century when Johannes Gutenberg in Mainz, Germany, invents movable type and sets up the first printing press, and books begin to get printed. And his first book, the famous Gutenberg Bible, is the Bible in Latin, but it didn't take long for Hebrew printing presses to be created. Hebrew font was created, especially in northern Italy, where you had printers in places like Venice and other cities. That's a whole other story. I want to take us back long before there was printing and talk about how any person in ancient Israel wrote anything and what is the evidence for that. Okay, first reminder. On the bottom there, you see the Hebrew alphabet, which we use today, the 22 letters of the alphabet. Even that is relatively new in the world of antiquity, that is, because in the middle of your screen, you see what we call the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, essentially the Phoenician alphabet. By the way, when I teach this to my students, I always have to explain to them what the word paleo means. I don't have to do that anymore. Half of them are on paleo diets now, so I'm okay with just using the word. And of course, it means the old Hebrew script. And there you see the 22 letters from Aleph to Taf. There's a one-to-one correspondence. Now, the Aleph may not look like today's Aleph, and the Bet may not look like today's Bet. Some of them still have some familiarity, perhaps the Shin. The next to last letter still looks like the Shin. But basically, this 22 letters that you see in front of you is the way people in ancient Israel wrote. So if King David was writing, or King Solomon was writing, or the prophet Isaiah was writing, or dictating something to a scribe, these are the 22 letters they would have used. The more familiar alphabet, which we use today, has only been in use for about 2,400 years. So we're looking at a time. Everything I'm going to show you today was written, not everything, most of what I'm going to show you today is written in that old alphabet. Okay, normally I would start with something from ancient Israel, meaning the people of Israel. But there's been a new discovery only in the last few months, and I decided this was a perfect opportunity to share this with you. And taking us back before there was an Israel. Now we're in the land of Israel right here. This Tel, archaeological site, is Tel Lachish. It is adjoining Moshav Lachish, about 50 kilometers southwest of Jerusalem. In 2016, this ivory comb was found. Now, archaeologists have found, digging there, archaeologists from the Hebrew University, archaeologists have found ivory combs elsewhere in Israel and in Egypt. But this was unique because only this past year, in the last 6 months, did someone realize that, in fact, it is incised with Hebrew letters, or shall we call them Canaanite letters. For 6 years, this has been sitting in the storeroom of the archaeological finds, and as I'll show you in a moment, I recently inspected it, and it is true that if you look straight on, you really don't see anything. If you shine a light on it from the side, only then are the letters visible. And so only in 2022, 6 years after this ivory comb was discovered, did anybody read it. Here's a line drawing of it. Here is what it says. It is comprised of these words here at the bottom. And it says, may this ivory, or literally it's something like tooth, uproot the lice of the hair and of the beard. How's that? Probably the oldest sentence in the Canaanite language, of which Hebrew is a dialect. So if you know some basic Hebrew, none of these are really, the only word here that's basic is se'ar, the next to last word for hair. The word for beard is slightly different from what we know in Hebrew. The first verb there is natash, to uproot. So we would read this something like yitosh. Anyway, this is a fascinating discovery, and I wanted to share it with you. And in fact, there's even a louse still to be found within the teeth of the comb. All of this, of course, is put to the laboratory, and the archaeologists have taken care of everything, including reading the inscription, studying the ivory, and looking for any organic material, including the ivory, but also the louse that you see here. And most remarkably, it was published extremely quickly. JJAR, which you see there in the text box, is the Jerusalem Journal of Archaeology. And it's an online journal only, which means as soon as you make a discovery, you can get it published very quickly online. The last author on the of the scholars who worked here, Yosef Garfinkel, is the lead archaeologist at Lachish and one of the editors of JJAR. And so he gets responsibility for this, although pride of place is to Daniel Weinstub of Ben Gurion University, who was actually the one who read the inscription. And because ivory is an organic material, right? It was once a living, part of a living creature from an elephant. There was an attempt to date the comb through carbon-14 testing. They tried 2 different tests at a laboratory in Oxford, and both of them were unsuccessful. There was not enough carbon material, or I don't know anything about the science or the poor preservation of the carbon. But so we don't know the exact date, but the archaeologists estimate 18th century BCE. I just want to remind you that's about 600 years before our earliest biblical text. But here we have something written in, we'll call it Old Canaanite or something like that. And then my colleague Yosef Garfinkel invited me to come see the little comb. And although that picture looks like it's a really big thing, you can see it in my hands inside the box. It's a tiny little comb. And there I was just last month at the Hebrew University. And big smile, yes, because this is a great treat to be able to see this object. And eventually it'll be on display at the Israel Museum. But for right now, it's kept, believe it or not, in Professor Garfinkel's office on the Mount Scopus campus. I hope he has a good safe for it. Okay, that is something really new and exciting. I wasn't planning when we set this lecture series up a few months ago to even talk about it, but I thought there's a great new piece of scholarship to give you. Now, we turn to ancient Israel. The topographical map that you see here is essentially a reminder that the people of Israel lived in what we call the Central Mountains. The 821 here, 821 meters above sea level, is where Jerusalem is located, and we'll be looking at Jerusalem as well. But I want to show you some of the areas around the area where inscriptions, our earliest inscriptions, have been found. We start with a place called Izbet Sarta. This was discovered in 1976. And we have to have a name for everything. I know every field has a jargon in its technical terms. We call this an ABCdery, meaning that the ABC, or the alphabet, or in this case, the Aleph Bet, has been written out, the 22 letters. Now, there's the photo of it. What scholars do is they create a line drawing. And the truth is that those first 4 lines are pretty primitive and mostly just gibberish. They appear to just be some probably a young person learning to write the alphabet. But the 5th line, which you see here, or down here transcribed, are the 22 letters of the alphabet. And it is our oldest alphabet of the Hebrew script that we have. And by the way, it is written left to right. Everything that you take for granted, like the order, or the direction rather, of writing from right to left, and as we'll see in a few minutes, even the order of the 22 letters, everything is still in flux during these early centuries. And to give you a sense of how this relates to the Bible, 12th, 11th century BCE would be the time of Joshua and the Judges. So give you a sense that this is still pretty early on with the Israelites in the land of Canaan. So I've transcribed the Hebrew letters here right to left, but they are actually written, as I said, this is much easier to type right to left in Hebrew, but they're actually written left to right. And there on line 5, you see the alphabet. And if you start from the beginning, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, we're fine. But then look what happens. Chet before Zion. never seen that before. And then towards the end, pay before ayin. Okay, hold that thought, right? The alphabet, the order of the letters, more or less fixed, but there's still some flexibility when it comes to certain letter combinations. We now go to Tel Zayit, a site all in that Central Hill country. And about, I think it's now 17 years ago, archaeologists are working there and they find this stone bowl in a wall. You see the stone above it? This is a wall. This means that the bowl was used now was in what we call secondary use. It wasn't originally obviously in a wall. It was a bowl. I'll show you in a minute. And somebody said, okay, we don't need this anymore. This would be like a great piece of the wall. And they just stuck it in the wall. And somebody with good eyes was able to see, and I hope you can see them as well, the letters inscribed on the bowl. Here's the bowl once it was removed from the wall. It was probably used as a, some sort of mortar and pestle kind of combination, right? The mortar. Here's a close-up of those letters. And again, it's just an alphabet. On the top is a close-up of the Aleph through Hey. Beginning of the alphabet, on the bottom is the end of the alphabet, Kof through Taf, an ABCD. And here's the entire alphabet. Again, the line drawing helps you read it more easily. This is written right to left. Want to follow the little bouncing ball, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled. But again, the order of the letters is still in flux. If you look at the bottom, Vav before Hey, Chet before Zayin, Pei before Ayin, right? So, and Kof is written twice, by the way. That may, we think Kof is written twice. He tried once and then wrote it again before we get to the Resh Shin Tzadi. This is how we begin to study these ancient inscriptions. Now, we have no other evidence for those inverted letter combos, but we do have evidence for the Pei before Ayin, which you have seen now in the prior inscription and also in this one. The Book of Lamentations, Echa, which we read on Tisha B'Av, has what we call alphabetic acrostics. You go from Aleph to Taf in a 22-verse chapter. And in chapters 2, 3, and 4, the Pei verse appears before the Ayin verse. And scholars were always pondering this, including the ancient rabbis who talk about this in the Talmud. Everyone had lost track of the fact that once upon a time in the alphabet, Pei could appear before Ayin. And we now know that that's the case because the Tel Zayit stone bowl inscription and the other one I showed you actually has the Pei before the Ayin. So these are all the little bits and pieces we learn about how people wrote in ancient Israel. Now let's go to Gezer, another archaeological site in the area. And here, more than a century ago, this stone inscription was found. It's now in the Istanbul Museum, dated to the 10th century. You see the letter forms, actually easier to read now. This is written by someone who can actually write better. But this has to be incised into a limestone, which is a soft stone, but you still have to incise it. So you're not going to get really smooth letter writing. And it turns out to be an agricultural calendar, something like a farmer's almanac, which tells you how many months of this and how many months of that, of the various activities through the agricultural year, harvesting flax, harvesting barley, and so on and so forth. A great piece of Hebrew writing. Now, we now go to Khirbet Keyafa. I'm going to put all this together for you in a few minutes, and then I'm actually going to take a break and invite questions. We'll do a bigger Q&A at the end. This is another site excavated by the same Professor Yosef Garfinkel of the Hebrew University. And it's a place whose name is not 100% sure, but we assume it's the biblical site of Sha'arayim, mentioned in the book of Joshua. Sha'arayim in Hebrew means two gates. And for a city this size, it's unusual to have more than a single gate, but because it has two gates, which you see here, you can actually see them here on the aerial photo. Here's the first gate, here's the second gate inside the perimeter city wall. Because of that, we assume, and it works geographically, we assume this is the site of Sha'arayim. And there in 2008, Yosef Garfinkel found this ostrakon, An ostrakon is a piece of clay written with ink. In other words, it's not like the other items which I've shown you, which were incised into stone, right, with a fine chisel, like the Gezer calendar or the Tel Zayit bowl. This is written with ink on clay, and that's what an ostrakon is. And it's 5 lines of text. Here's the line drawing, and this letter writing is again quite primitive. There's some debate as to what some of these letters are, but here's a tentative translation by Gershon Galil of the University of Haifa, and it turns out to talk about the things that we know about from the Bible, right? You're supposed to protect the underprivileged, the slave, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the poor, and so on and so forth. And it mentions the word king. It uses the word melech. So these are good biblical ideas in a very early inscription from the 10th century BCE, same time as the Gezer calendar. And we'll come back and talk about why the 10th century is so important. And then this was also found on this pithos, a large jar. This is a clay vessel, and it also has a Hebrew inscription around the rim. In this case, the potter would have done it himself or invited a scribe to come in and to incise into the wet clay the letters of the alphabet, because it says such and such belonging to Eshbaal ben Bedah, Eshbaal the son of Bedah. We don't know who this person is, but it obviously was his ownership of this vase, this pithos, this vessel. If this helps you, it's like your plates, your dishes at home. If you turn them upside down, something was incised into the plate before ownership or manufacture, etc. Before the pottery was fired. That's what you have here as well. And these are the bits and pieces as they were found, all put back together by the pottery restorer, a very important person on any archaeological dig. This is the area we've been talking about. You see where Gezer is, you see where Sha'arayim is. These are to the west and southwest of Jerusalem. And the other 2 places that I've shown you, Tel Zayit is within this oval, and Keyafa is just to the north of this oval. So you're getting a sense of where early Israelite writing was to be found. But what about Jerusalem? This was found in Jerusalem in 2013. Do you realize how many of these were found in the 21st century? Just about everything I'm showing you of these early inscriptions was found only in the last decade or 2. Again, only a few letters on a clay vessel. Again, they would have been incised before the clay was fired, before the pot went into the kiln. And a few letters, but from the time of David and Solomon in the 10th century, ruling in Jerusalem. This is one possible reading of it. Something like Natan or Naton, Chelkam, give them their share. And maybe this was some sort of charity vessel where people deposited things. There's no money yet, right? There are no coins, but you could put silver or perhaps anything else inside. We don't know. It's only a handful of letters, but it's evidence for writing at an early time in ancient Israel. Now, why is the 10th century so important? This is the time, as I just mentioned, when David and Solomon were ruling in Jerusalem. And biblical scholars, myself included, believe that so much of the Bible comes from that very same 10th century. And we really did not have, other than the Gezer calendar inscription, an amount of material from the 10th century until the last decade or decade and a half. And so it's a growing amount of evidence, including now at least one bit of writing from Jerusalem during this time period. Okay. This brings us on to a new topic. So let me just invite any questions for the moment. If anybody wants to ask a question, as I said, we'll have a longer Q&A at the end, but I thought this would be a good place just to get some conversation going if anybody would like to ask a question, especially if there's anything that I haven't explained fully. Anyone, go ahead. Everything is perfectly clear.
Question.
Dr. Rendsburg, here in the Bay Midrash, we have a question. You have to speak loudly.
You mentioned use of ink in writing on clay? Is that the first time we hear about ink or the use of ink?
No, I'm going to show you some ancient Egyptian material in just a second. The Egyptians were writing with ink on papyrus for almost 2,000 years before the Israelites did. But the technology of ink, and we'll talk about papyrus, all came from Egypt. In Mesopotamia, the other great civilization, Mesopotamia, Babylonia, and so on, they wrote on clay tablets with a stylus, incising it into the clay. But in Egypt, they wrote with papyrus. The most writing, unless it's on a tomb wall or a temple wall, it's ink on papyrus, as I'll show you in just a second. Yeah, and so that's where the technology would have come from.
Great. One question in the chat just came. When does the script in our Torah scrolls develop? I don't know if you're going to hit that. But even with that, let me back you up further and say, what's the current thinking and scholarship around the development of alphabets? You know, some of us might have heard the Phoenicians were the first. Some of us might link it to Greece. What is the beginning at this point in terms of scholars' thoughts about alphabets coming together, and how did they even get into this lineup, or the ideas of letters that symbolize? Right. Egyptians obviously use hieroglyphics. And that's another piece of the tale we've heard. But what's the current thinking out there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and again, there's a lot of work is being done on the alphabet right now. And in particular, I want to mention Orly Goldwasser of the Hebrew University, whom I also just saw in Israel, who is the lead Egyptologist, the senior Egyptologist in Israel. She not only she, but others believe, everybody believes, that the Egyptian hieroglyphs were the stimulus for the alphabet. So that Semites, I don't want to say Israelites, Semites from the greater land of Canaan, we're just going to call them that. It's long before there are Phoenicians, long before there are Israelites, probably going back to the beginning of the second millennium BCE, that would be about 4,000 years ago. Semites who were exposed to Egyptian writing saw symbols like a head, like a hand, like a house, all of which are included in the hundreds of different signs which are part of hieroglyphics. But what they did was they simplified it to an alphabet of anywhere between 22 and 30 letters. The Hebrew Phoenician one is 22, but we also know of some longer alphabets. And they used a symbol like the hand, and they used a symbol like the head, and so on, basic items out of everyday life, a snake. And that's how the alphabet got created. Now, whether it happened in the 20th century BCE or the 19th or 18th century BCE or a little bit later, this is what scholars are debating. But probably it happened out there in the Sinai, the sort of the meeting ground of Semites from the land of Canaan and Egyptians, especially in the mining areas of the Sinai, where the Egyptians would mine turquoise and other precious gems. So it's a great question that's still unfolding, but that's where we are today. I'll get to the other part of the alphabet, how it becomes more recognizable in the next half an hour or so.
So that's terrific. And just before you get to that more recognizable, I didn't know if you were going to say among the last things in the last decade, whether or not there have been any fragments of scrolls like we would expect of rabbinic scrolls and the halacha, the Jewish law surrounding them. Have we unearthed any kind of scrolls that we've yet to interpret or read that come from the same type of parchment? And where does parchment in the Canaanite region in the 12th to 6th century BCE and beyond, where does that play in, or is it not around yet?
It's not, all forthcoming in the next half hour.
Okay, great.
Yeah, we're going to get to parchment. It's a really important aspect. But first, we have to talk about papyrus. So that's a great segue to get back to
Could I ask you a quick question before
Sure,
we
go ahead.
get the alphabet? So is it a Jewish contribution to change from hieroglyphic symbols to phonetic sounds? Was that going on in Greece too?
Greece is all much later. So remove Greece from the picture. The alphabet spread from the Phoenicians to Greece. That we know for sure. probably around the year 1000, thereabouts.
Okay, much later.
But no, the alphabet is pre-Jewish, pre-Israelite. And remember, the people of Israel, like everybody else in Canaan, the Moabites, the Israelites, the Edomites, the Phoenicians, the Philistines, they're all part of the same culture, all using the same alphabet, all speaking the same language, except in different dialects. No different than British English from American English, from Canadian English, from Australian English, and so on. So they could all communicate with each other. They all use the same alphabet. But it goes back 600-700 years before Israel emerges in the historical record.
Right, thank you.
Okay, great. So let's go to let me go to the next image here and talk about papyrus. It's a great segue. As I said, the Egyptians were writing on papyrus, at least from what we call the third millennium. I don't know what the oldest papyrus is, but certainly from around 2000 BCE onward, we have papyrus. And I'm sure we have some older ones. There's a fascinating tale called the Tale of Wenamun. We actually have only a single copy of this text, and it's in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. It dates from the 11th century, so this is the time of Israel. Israel's now on the historical record. We don't have good color photos of it, but we do have good black and white photos published over 100 years ago. And this is actually, sidebar comment here, this is actually hieratic. This is the cursive form of hieroglyphics. So you can still see, for example, a snake right here, but it's not the hieroglyphs. Many of the other symbols are more cursive in form, but there's a one-to-one correspondence. You know, I wrote on the right here the word papyrus. Okay, if I were to write that with an ink pen or a pencil on a piece of paper, it wouldn't look like that word papyrus. You could still read it and be a one-to-one correspondence between my print and my script. Does any of us ever write anything anymore, right? We just type it all out on our devices. But when we do write something out, we're writing in a cursive. That's what this is here. They wrote a cursive form on the papyrus. And here's another part of this tale. Now, why is this so important? Wenamun was an Egyptian aristocrat who lived in Thebes, in what is modern-day Luxor, the south of Egypt, and he was sent on a mission by the temple of Karnak priests to go to Lebanon to procure cedar wood. The country of Egypt, the Nile Valley, is blessed with all manner of wonderful things. Ancient Egypt basically had everything they needed in the way of food, in the way of mineral wealth, especially gold. And if they didn't have to travel far, as I mentioned, to get turquoise from the Sinai, but they didn't have, there are no trees, there are no forests in Egypt, right? There's some palm trees, not very good for building. There's some acacia trees, fine if you want to build the Ark of the Covenant and other parts of the tabernacle, but there are no real great cypress and cedar trees. For that, you have to go to what is today the north of Israel and Lebanon. And so he travels there, and you see the map here. He goes up the coast, and he comes to the city of Byblos in northern Lebanon, north of Beirut. Here's the picture of the excavations. And there is some debate between Wenamun, the Egyptian traveler, and the local people who say, wait a minute, we don't remember it that way. Wenamun was telling him, remember, this happened. And they said, no. So what do? The king of Byblos ordered that the scrolls of the days, the chronicles, the royal annals be brought forward, and they were read in his presence. And they found in that the accounting said there was an entry for 1,000 deben, at some weight of silver and so on. And then in another episode, while Wenamun is still there in Byblos, a messenger from Egypt arrives by ship with a whole bunch of stuff on board, gold, silver, royal linen, and so on. I do hope that the 30 baskets of fish there at the end was dried fish. I imagine that's what they were, smoked fish or something like that. So why am I showing you this? It shows us that in Phoenicia, in the 11th century, they had scrolls that they kept in the palace that they could bring out of the archive to read if necessary. And if they could do that in Phoenicia, we believe they could do that in Israel as well, especially just a few decades after this, when King David establishes Jerusalem as the capital, builds a royal palace, and so on. This is what papyrus looks like. This is the kind of stuff you can buy in Egypt today. They still make it for tourists. It's made from this plant that grows along the banks of the Nile. My old photo is getting a little grayed here and is no longer as clear and crisp as it should be, but I love still showing the photo I took when I was in Egypt from the boat crossing the Nile. Here's a better photo of what the papyrus plant looks like up close. And this is how they would make their writing material. Our English word paper actually comes from papyrus, the same word. Of course, we use wood pulp basically, but they used this plant to create papyrus scrolls, and then they wrote on them in ink, as you see in this example. And just a few blocks from where you are is this beautiful long papyrus scroll. This is a single papyrus scroll displayed at the museum, at the Metropolitan Museum in the Egyptian galleries of the Book of the Dead. It's the second longest scroll ever found. The longest one is in the British Museum in London, which is actually twice as long as this one, just to give you a sense of how the Egyptians could write up these long papyrus scrolls. Now, the problem is, in contrast to the exceedingly arid climate of Egypt, which has preserved papyrus scrolls such as the one I just showed you in toto, especially in tombs, no scrolls have ever been found in the land of Canaan, though we know that the Phoenicians and the Israelites and all these other people were writing their literary compositions on papyrus scrolls. So if you want to know how the book of Genesis was written, remember in the beginning, the books of the Torah were all separate scrolls. If you want to know how the book of Genesis was written, or Exodus, it would have been written on a papyrus scroll, and it would have looked physically like this, except there would have been only 22-letter alphabet symbols. So this gives you a sense of what they looked like, although we don't have any examples, although hold that thought. Okay, what we typically do have from ancient Israel are the remains of stuff that is not perishable. And I showed you a few early ones. Here's a few more. An ostrakhan from Samaria, mentioning pure olive oil, 8th century. Another ostrakhan from Samaria relating to measuring barley. I love the fact that when the scribe has room, this is the mem and this is the nun. I love the fact that he has these big, long flourishes down here, so he's got plenty of room at the bottom of the writing surface there. This is a letter from Lachish around 600 BCE, from one military man to another. Pretty well preserved. You could see they could really write out an entire letter on a piece of clay. What about the biblical text? These are the tombs at a place called Ketef Hinnom in Jerusalem. It's across the Hinnom Valley from the city walls of Jerusalem, dated to the 7th century BCE. And in these tombs in the 1970s, the archaeologists found these two tiny silver amulets. These are how they are on display now in the Israel Museum. When I say tiny, I'll show you what I mean by that. Silver amulets rolled up. These had to be unrolled by specialists in the conservation lab of the Israel Museum. They were found here in these tombs, and then they were unrolled. Here is the one on the amulet number 1. And it turns out when it was unrolled that it is a variant version of the priestly blessings from Numbers chapter 6. Look at the size of this thing. The whole thing is less than 4 inches high, 1 inch wide. The second amulet is even smaller, 1.5 inches high, 1/2 inch in diameter, wide across. Again, a variant of the priestly blessing. So on the right there, you know the text from Numbers chapter 6, Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, and so on. Did you cite it this morning, Rabbi Bolton, at the Pidyon Haben? Yes, you did. Okay. It is obviously part of Jewish liturgy in the repetition of the Amidah and in all manner of occasions, Brit Milah, Pidyon Haben, Bar Mitzvah, Bat Mitzvah, and so on and so forth, Simchat Bat, weddings. That's the biblical text there. Numbers chapter 6. And it is actually inscribed on those 2 silver amulets, which were placed in a tomb 2,600 plus years ago. Really remarkable. This is the oldest biblical text we have ever found. Again, not on a papyrus scroll, which is perishable, but on a silver, tiny little silver scroll, which of course is non-perishable. Now, the other thing we find in excavations, and this is how people wrote in ancient Israel, they had what are called seals and bullae. This is a seal. It's an oval shape about the size of my thumb here, the upper part of my thumb. And you write your name on it, and you have some artwork. And this actually says that it belongs to Shema, who is the servant of Jeroboam II, the king of Israel. Now, and those are his dates. These seals would be impressed into clay. Now you have to remember that the seal cutter who made this had to write, it doesn't really matter which way the lion faces, left or right, but he had to write the letters inverted, because when you stamp it, you want to be able to read it. And again, I have to explain this to my students. They have no idea what I'm talking about. You go to the post office, nothing gets stamped anymore, maybe, or passport control, right? But all of those stamps at the post office, at the library, when you would take a book out, at the passport control, all the letters are inverted in the actual stamp. So when you stamp it, you can actually read it correctly. Same thing here. And they were impressed into small pieces of clay, singular bulla, plural bullae. And this is the bulla of Hezekiah, the king of Judah, found in Jerusalem, again, about a decade ago by Eilat Mazar. Recently deceased, the archaeologist of the City of David excavations. And there is the name of Hezekiah, the king of, and then it says king of Judah. So we have these items. Now, what were these used for? By the way, if you know modern Hebrew, bull is the word for stamp, still today in modern Hebrew. That's related to our word bulla here. You have a papyrus scroll, you write on it, and this is a facsimile of a scroll with the bulla in place. You write your text, you roll it up or you fold the papyrus, you tie it up with these rope over here, and on the outside you have a tagline. If it's a letter to somebody, it's the addressee. If it's something else, the contents, 1 or 2 words. And then you seal it with a piece of clay, still wet, and you stamp your seal into it, as I showed you before, and you have the bulla showing you who has written or who owns this document. This is the way people wrote in the ancient world. And we find the bullae and the seals frequently in excavations because they, again, are non-perishable, but the whole papyrus has gone because that is biodegradable. Sometimes you can actually see, look at the image on the left, you can actually see the rope marks inside the bulla. Right? This one is slightly fractured, but there is the obverse of the bulla on the right with the man who owned it. We do occasionally, by the way, have the bullae of females as well. Most are males. And you can see the rope marks on the back of it because, again, it was looking like this in reality, except everything fell apart. The rope is biodegradable. The papyrus is biodegradable. This is what we have, but I love showing the rope marks. Now, I said hold that thought a moment ago. We have no real papyrus scrolls from ancient Israel, but we do have 2 small papyrus fragments, both found near the Dead Sea. No surprise, because that's where we have an arid climate. This was found at a place called Wadi Morabat, which is near Ein Gedi. It was found in 1952, and it's actually a palimpsest. You can see I wrote the word palimpsest there in the text box. What does that mean? A palimpsest is a technical term for a piece of writing which was then scraped off and reused. If you can see this, you have lines of writing here which were scraped off, and then this is the new writing on top of it. That's called a palimpsest. You could actually erase by scraping off the ink from papyrus or parchment. It's actually referred to in the Mishnah. The rabbis use the term niyar machuk, which is a scraped off writing surface. The upper text is there on the top, and that was the original text. It was a letter from somebody to somebody else. And on the bottom, you see what is the new text that was written, basically just a list of names followed by numerals, but at least it gives us one piece of papyrus from ancient Israel. And then this one found in 2016, exact provenance unknown, but near the Dead Sea. And it actually is a delivery tag of some sort. Something or other from the king, can't read the first word, it's broken, but something or other from the king, from his cave, jars of wine for Jerusalem. And this is the word Jerusalem written out here at the end. And again, this is a Paleo-Hebrew alphabet, ink on papyrus. And I've transcribed it. If you can read Hebrew there on the bottom right, I've transcribed it for you. And you may say, wait a minute, how come there's a yod at the end of this line and a nun over here at the end of the next line, the word for wine, and then the dot is the word divider, which I've placed here. They didn't care. They just kept writing. If they ran out of space, which they did, they put the letter on the next line. There's no hyphenation. The word just continues. I think we call this word wrap or something like that. It just goes down to the next line. And ditto here, here's a nun and a taf, but that's not a word. Whatever preceded it up here, we can't read. It's broken. So it must be some other word, since nun taf doesn't mean anything in Hebrew by itself. So this gives you a sense of how we are able to piece together the bits of writing from ancient Israel. And then this happens. By the way, the papyrus was imported from Egypt. There is a papyrus plant, not exactly another variety, that grows in the Upper Jordan Valley, in the Kula Valley still today. It's not as good a commodity as the papyrus from Egypt. So if you wanted high quality papyrus, you imported it from Egypt. And then this happened. We moved to parchment. The problem with papyrus is you have to import it from Egypt. It's really the only place. As I said, you can get a poor quality version locally in Israel, but you have to import it. And for the people of Israel, and for the people of Phoenicia, and for people farther away, Anatolia, modern day Turkey, Greece, etc., it's expensive to import papyrus from Egypt just so you have a writing surface for your documents. Somebody came up with the idea of using animal skins, parchment, from these fellows in particular, from goats. This is goat skin being stretched on a stretcher. And although this is a modern parchment maker, you can imagine in ancient times, there's no high tech involved in what you see here. In antiquity, it would have looked exactly the same as what you see here, and certainly so in the Middle Ages. Here is an illustration from a medieval manuscript, just a few decades before Gutenberg, by the way, who is stretching, a man showing how you stretch parchment on a frame and scrape it to smooth it out with the tool that he has in his hand. So the technology is old and hasn't changed in more than 2,000 years. And anyone who's a professional sophère, of course, knows this. Here is a parchment text ready for writing nice and smooth. Parchment was invented in the ancient city of Pergamon in what is today Western Turkey in the 6th or 5th century. These people got tired of importing papyrus from Egypt. By this point, Homer has already become canonical in the Greek tradition. These people didn't want to constantly import papyrus, and they created the concept of parchment. Our word parchment, in fact, is a slightly altered form of the city name Pergamon. Pergamon, parchment. Many items in the world are given the name of the place from which they come. Most famously in English, fine porcelain, what do we call it? China, right? Because it was the Chinese who created porcelain. You have an Afghan, it came from Afghanistan, and so on and so forth, right? We call things after the name of the place from which they come, especially precious, special commodities. So parchment and pergamon are basically the same item, same name for the city. And that brings us to the creation of parchment scrolls, obviously still in use in the Jewish tradition, ad hayom hazeh, down to the present day. At around the same time when parchment was invented, coincidentally, the alphabet system switches. The alphabet had developed over time, and the Paleo-Hebrew script morphs into a new kind of script that is now legible for you and me, if you can know Hebrew, as I will show you. Our earliest parchment scrolls come from Qumran on the shore of the Dead Sea, dated to around, actually what I show here in this graphic is the date of the community that lived there from around 150 BCE onward. But we think some of the scrolls are older than that. They go back 100 or maybe even 150 years before there was a community of Qumran. They must have brought their scrolls from elsewhere. And they are on parchment, and they were found in the caves at Qumran. And many of you, I hope, have visited the site. It is an absolutely wonderful place. And again, my wife and I were just there a few months ago during our time in Israel. And in cave 1, in these jars were found these parchment scrolls that you see here on the right. And most famously, the Great Isaiah Scroll. This is the complete book of Isaiah written on parchment, 54 columns. And I'm going to zoom in a moment, but I want to again talk about the physical properties of writing a scroll. Do you realize nothing has changed in 2,000 years? Next time you're at the Bima, next time you have an Aliyah, take a moment just to look at the physical properties of the Torah scroll, still written by hand, by a sofer, with ink, on parchment. And how do you write it? You write 3 columns to a sheet, it can be more, and then you sew them up. Do you see the seam right here? So you have 3 columns of text. This is the very beginning of Isaiah. You have 3 columns of text, and then you have a stitching and 3 columns on the next sheet, and that's how you create a scroll. It would have been the same, by the way, with the papyrus, but now we're talking about parchment. And here's the very end of the scroll. The last sheet only required 2 columns, and the book of Isaiah was completed. This is long before Hebrew has any vowel points. It's just the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet that you see here. There are no ta'amim, none of the markings that tell you how to punctuate and chant the text. What you do see, however, are paragraph breaks. So these are paragraph breaks here that you see, and one here and so on, white space on the text. So they already had paragraphing, but they did not have any vowel points yet. And you can see that obviously Hebrew's written right to left. It's right justified because that's going to be very easy. It's not perfectly left justified. The scribes don't really worry about that too much, but there is no more word wrapping. A word will be finished. There's no word that gets divided over 2 lines. So this word, for example, the scribe started it and he stuck it out into the left margin. You see a few other examples of that here. You don't go down and divide a word between 2 lines. This is the Great Isaiah Scroll. Now, what people always want to know is, do these texts differ in any way from the texts that we use today? And the answer is, it depends what you mean by differ. There are minor differences in every ancient copy of the Bible that we have from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have about 250 different copies of biblical texts. Only one of them is complete, the one we're working on here now, the book of Isaiah. But there always are minor differences. So as I always like to say, pig is still not kosher. The Sabbath is still on the 7th day. You're still not allowed to murder. Nothing has changed in the biblical text, but there are minor differences. And this is one that I love to show people. We're all familiar with this passage, again, because it is so much a part of Jewish liturgy. Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot Melech Haaretz Kavodo. And it begins with the word Kadosh, holy, 3 times. And it comes from Isaiah chapter 6, verse 3. That's the biblical text we use today. It's the biblical text that we've known for 2,000 years. But this text, which was written a little bit before that period, only has the word Kadosh twice. Kadosh, Kadosh, there you have it. And then it goes on, Adonai Tzvaot Melech Haaretz Tzvaot. Holy, holy, only written twice. So here comes some Gary humor. If you think the synagogue service is a little bit too long, here's your ancient license to remove one word from the liturgy, and you can just say Kadosh, Kadosh, and get out just a little bit earlier on Shabbat morning. How's that? I see Rabbi Bolton nodding. You can actually do that now because the Jews of ancient Qumran were doing that apparently with only 2 holies and not 3. Some of the other beautiful material that we have from Qumran, this is about 1/3 of the book of Psalms found in cave 11. You can see a lot of damage at the bottom of the scroll, but it's a great, great witness to the ancient poems of the book of Psalms. Here you see the letters that we recognize. You saw it already in the Isaiah scroll as well. And I've zoomed in here for you on Psalm 138. Let's again talk about the properties of writing. Notice that the text or the writing surface, the parchment, is lined. They would have had a ruler system where they could create vertical, or rather horizontal lines for the text. And over here, you see vertical lines for the margins as well. But look at the horizontal lines. The letters are below the line. It's a random thing. We write above the line. There's no reason why you have to write above the line. That's just the random system we use. Again, assuming we have, a ruled notebook or a ruled, writing pad. Again, all of these things are disappearing from our culture. But in ancient Israel and elsewhere, they wrote below the line. And the only letter that goes above the line in any which way is the upper part of the lamed, which you see. Otherwise, the letters are, the technical term for this, the letters are hung from the line. Now, if you're reading along here, you may notice that in various places, you have the Paleo-Hebrew script because this is the divine name. This is Yud He Vav He in the old script. So our scribe is writing out Psalm 138, in fact, the entire book of Psalms here, or we only have 1/3 of it remaining. And whenever he gets to the divine name, not only in this Psalm, but anywhere else, he uses the old Hebrew script, which apparently people could still read as a sign of honor and prestige and antiquity to write the name of God out in Yud He Vav He in the ancient script. Example out of our everyday life. The masthead of the New York Times is still written in that script, which we call a Gothic script, harking back to the early days of the New York Times and other newspapers when you wanted to set it off in some way. And we can all read it. It says the New York Times. If the entire newspaper were printed that way, I think we'd have a hard time reading it. But we can visually image just the New York Times in that old Gothic script. Do you ever think about these things every morning when your paper is delivered to your home? This is my analogy for the 4-letter name of God written this way in this text. But they were so adept still, they could actually write the entire book of Leviticus out in Paleo script. And this again is an important text from Cave 11. Letters are written below the line, but they wrote the whole book of Leviticus in the Paleo script. People could still read it fluently, otherwise they wouldn't have been writing it that way. Again, notice the physical properties of writing. Do you realize all of this is important for understanding how the Chumash got into your synagogue pew, right? It's thousands of years of literary and technical development to get from then to today. Very fragmentary material from the book of Samuel. By the way, color photos. The black and white photos are actually easier to read. Everybody see that? I mean, you can actually read them more easily. Now I want to take you to Masada at the southern end of the Dead Sea, and then we'll finish with En Gedi. We all go to Masada and we just wonder at the place. There's a synagogue atop Masada, and in this synagogue and in the adjoining room were found biblical texts as well. I always like to point this out. We know about Masada for so many amazing reasons, but it also gives us, again, testimony to our ancient texts. In this case, by the way, notice, unlike the Psalm scroll from Qumran that I showed you, if you look here on the right, the book of Psalms is actually being written out in poetic fashion. So we're seeing a transition from the previous one I showed you, which would have looked like prose paragraphing, to poetic stanza-like presentation of the book of Psalms. And we end with En Gedi. I started with something really fascinating, the ivory comb. We end with something equally fascinating. We go to En Gedi. Again, a marvelous site for all sorts of reasons. The nature of En Gedi is this huge oasis in on the shore of the Dead Sea. But there's a synagogue there from the 5th, 6th centuries CE. So about 1600 years ago, this synagogue was in existence. It was excavated by archaeologists in 1970. You can still visit it. And again, my wife and I were there just recently. We never drive down the shore of the Dead Sea without stopping at Qumran, En Gedi, Nature Reserve and Synagogue, and Masada. This is the synagogue. It was accidentally destroyed by fire and sort of frozen in time because of that. Nobody assumes anything nefarious happened. It was probably an accidental fire. Remember, before modernity, there's no easy way to put out a fire once it gets started. This is the Bima area right here. And there would have been a wooden cabinet of sorts for the ark with the scrolls in it. When archaeologists excavated this place 50 years ago, they found, lying right where I just showed you, a burnt scroll. Due to the fire, one of the scrolls there burnt. And it's been sitting around for 50 years. Almost 50 years, 52 years now, 53, but almost 50 years it was sitting there because archaeologists never throw anything away. I don't mean it was sitting in the synagogue, it was sitting in the storehouse of the Israel Antiquities Authority. They have this massive storage facility where all material goes. Only X percent can be on display at the Israel Museum and other museums, and they have this huge storage facility. Along comes Professor Brent Seals of the University of Kentucky. I have his name there for you at the bottom. He's a physicist, and he has created a method of reading ancient scrolls that cannot be unrolled. And he came to Israel with his equipment, the Brooker SkyScan Model 1176 Micro CT scanner. You all have one of those downstairs in your basement, okay? And he starts scanning the En Gedi scroll with what you see here. Now, I'm not a scientist. I don't know what I'm talking about here, but this is what CT scanners can do today. And since then, Professor Seals now has gone to Pompeii and other places to virtually read the scrolls that cannot be unrolled because they were burnt in antiquity. And this is what his scan showed. It is the book of Leviticus, chapters 1 and 2. So there's the burnt scroll on the right. And this is the very beginning of the book of Leviticus right here, chapter 1. It continues on to chapter 2. I want to call attention to this here. This is a blank piece of text. We therefore know that this was just the book of Leviticus, not the entire Torah, because you would have had the end of Exodus there. We call this a handle scroll. You have to hold on to the text. And if you didn't have a handle scroll there, your hands would be on the ink. And this has nothing to do with sanctity or something like that. It has to do with the practicality because you could chip off the ink. Remember, ink doesn't get absorbed into the parchment. It can chip off, as we know from the occasional Shabbat morning in the synagogue when we have to stop and pause because we can't read a word. So this is a handle scroll. It tells us that the book of Leviticus was its own scroll. In the rabbinic texts, including the Talmud, we have reference to a complete Sefer Torah of 5 scrolls. And we also have reference to the books, according to what the rabbis say, Megillah, Megillah, each book written in its own scroll. This is an example of the Megillah, Megillah, each book written in its own scroll. We can tell that because of the handle scroll. And by the way, the Israelis see this photo and they say, Maza im penny im Lincoln. What's this with the penny here with Lincoln there on a penny? Well, because they wanted to pay homage to the University of Kentucky, where Lincoln was born, of course. So they put a penny there. It also gives you a sense of scale to show you the size of this text. This is science and the humanities merging at its best. They did a carbon-14 analysis on the scroll. All you need is a tiny little fleck this size. You wouldn't have to ruin any of the writing. Maybe this is the fleck they took or something like that. They took it to the Weizmann Institute in Israel, and a 90% probability that it's from around the year 300. The synagogue was destroyed in the year 600, which means this scroll was being used in that synagogue for centuries. That's no surprise, because synagogues have always used scrolls for centuries. We still do today. We know many synagogues that still have their scrolls going back centuries. This one was in use for at least 300 centuries and probably would have continued on if it weren't for the accidental fire. Remember, when you scan something, you get reverse images. So this is the white lettering on the blackish parchment. In reality, you can play with this in Photoshop. In reality, of course, it would have been black ink on the whitish parchment. And this is how we're able to understand the book of Leviticus, chapters 1 and 2. And again, this is just amazing, amazing technology. I want to remind you, it still looks like this, right? This is what it still looks like. But thank you, modern science, because we can actually read it instead of just looking at it like this. It took 45 years for us to digitally virtually unroll the Engedi scroll. But it gives us a sense of what synagogue scrolls look like. No surprise, no different than the ones that are in your synagogue at Or Zarua or in any other synagogue in the world. And again, this is a photo of the Engedi synagogue. We'll end with that and a todah in Hebrew to all of you who have joined us, and of course, happy to take all manner of questions. Let's do it.
Dr. Rendsburg, great. Thank you for an incredible presentation this morning. How about the actual transition to the alphabet? This recognizable Ashuri, even with the preservation of the Paleo-Hebraic and the beautiful font for God's name in the Psalms, third of the Psalms scroll we have. Could you dive down a little deeper in the Ashuri font we've now gotten that we continue to read?
Yeah, I gave the simple version of that. So this is what happened. The people of the land of Canaan, the Israelites, the Phoenicians, and everybody else in that region, what is today Israel, Lebanon, they kept using the old system. But the alphabet spread to the Arameans. The Arameans, who were using the Aramaic language, were living in what is today Syria and Iraq, especially northern Iraq. And they had the same 22 letters, but they developed it differently. Their scribes changed the forms of the letters over time. As we'll see next week and the week after, we'll be looking at medieval manuscripts. When you study a medieval manuscript, very often the first thing you need to do, and I do this, you spend an hour just learning the 22 letters of the alphabet. This would be true if you were reading a medieval Latin text, not if it was a professionally produced thing where every A looks like an A and every B looks like a B. But if it was a draft or somebody was just writing something out, you sometimes have to learn the alphabet. I mean, I will tell you, there are still times on the shopping list that my wife says to me, "What did you write down?" And I say to her, "What did you write down?" Because even though we know each other's handwritings very well, you have to study the alphabet. Oh, that's a G? Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay. So the Aramaic scribes changed their letter forms over the years, over the centuries. When the Jews went off into exile, they still knew the Paleo-Hebrew script, what we call the Paleo-Hebrew script, but they also started learning the Aramaic script from the Babylonian exile during the Persian period and so on. And that became more and more in use by everybody in the ancient world. The Aramaic script had spread from Mesopotamia to Egypt. Anybody who was writing in an alphabet was using those letter forms, those 22 letters, a little bit like our New York Times analogy, right? We're using these 22 letters, not the letters in the masthead anymore. And so the Jews said, everybody else is using these letters. We want to be participatory in a larger society for commerce, for economics and business and so on, trade. If we write it out in our script, they're not going to read it, be able to read it, ditto for the Phoenicians. So they all started adopting the Aramaic script. That's what happened. That's why Jews now have, or then had, two alphabets overlapping: the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet and the newer Hebrew alphabet, which we call Kitav Ashuri, which is Assyrian script because they found it in Assyria, Babylonia, Mesopotamia, etc. By the way, next time you're in Israel and you have a shekel coin, look at the coin up close, a shekel or 2 shekel or a 5 shekel coin. Look at them up close. They have the old Hebrew script on them. They've gone back to using those old Hebrew alphabets, sort of honoring the past of Israel when the shekel coin got invented.
Actually, I wanted to ask you, is there any elementary school, high school, middle school, high school, university requirement to learn the Paleo-Hebrew alphabet and the history of Hebrew to further this aspect of literacy? Is that a movement at all? Has it spilled into the kind of educational Misrad HaChinuch kind of moves? I don't know a single synagogue that does it, except for one, where I did know that there was a writing workshop in Paleo-Hebrew with an artist so that kids could actually practice it a little bit, but that's a whole different story.
I need to, well, the answer is I don't know about the Israeli scene. First of all, this is the domain of scholars and graduate students who are going off to read, to learn ancient Hebrew and ancient Phoenician and so on. I don't know that anybody's doing it per se, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were. And I have to go and ask my children. I think that one of their teachers in high school exposed them to it and taught them how to write the 22 letters.
Interesting.
I doubt that my kids remember it, but my son might still have some facility in it. I think he was a Jewish studies major in college. I think it's a great exercise. Let's do it. Let's talk to I'm speaking to a former Solomon Schechter principal. Let's do it. Okay.
Sounds like a great curriculum. It really is something that could be downloadable, a scholarship to practice. You have a few questions in the chat. The notion that we had vowels, proto-nikudot, perhaps, were there any kind of thoughts you could share about when that comes in? If there's a whole history, of course, of Masoretes, but perhaps there's something of a find before the Masoretic texts come together when they do with the nikudot and the vowels. And you also have in the chat the small differences like kadosh. Can we tell whether that this is a consistent difference from then to now, or was it a scribal error?
Oh, okay. The first one. So what the ancient scribes started doing is they would use the vav and the yod, as we do in modern Hebrew, to indicate vowels, the vav being used for o or u, and the yod being used especially for the long e vowel. So, for example, in earliest Hebrew, you would have written out the word ish, aleph shin. But after a while, they started writing it aleph yod shin. Now, the reader would just know, as we do in modern Hebrew, that the yod there is not a consonantal y sound, otherwise it would be ayish or something, but rather it's just standing for the e vowel, and you read it as ish. So that was an early development in Hebrew. And the vav would be used, for example, the word for generation, dor, would be in ancient times would be written Dalet Resh, as it is occasionally in the Bible. But they started writing the Vav there, and you just know to read that as Dalet Vav Resh, and you just to pronounce it as Dor. There's no consonantal sound to the second letter; it's just standing for the vowel O. So there were these early steps in that direction, but the actual recording of the nikudot, of the vowel signs, and the ta'amim, the accent signs, that happens in the 9th or 10th century. And I can say a little bit about it next week when we look at Cairo Geniza documents where we already have such text with the nikudot. So I'll make sure to show a few examples of that. And then in 2 weeks' time, we'll be looking at the crown jewel of all medieval manuscripts called the Kennicott Bible, produced in La Coruña, Spain. And you'll see it all there as well. So it's a long answer. Bottom line is, in antiquity, they started a system of showing long vowels, but it takes until the Middle Ages before you get all the vowels indicated with a new series of graphic system of dots and dashes. What was the other question about the?
Was Kadosh a scribal error?
Right.
Did we see it anywhere else? Did it? And how do scribal errors make? What knowing we have those? How does that make you think about ancient texts?
Yeah. I don't think it's a scribal error. I think that was probably just, a different tradition of passing down the text with two kadosh. I've thought about this. I have no way of proving it. It's the only place in the Bible where the same word appears 3 times in a row. So we have other places where you have twice in a row, including when God stops Abraham from sacrificing Isaac, and Avraham, and you also have Moshe, and you also have Yaakov. And early stories in Genesis and Exodus, and there are a few other places where the same word appears twice. In fact, dor is used for meaning forever. Usually dor va-dor, but you also have one place dor. So maybe it was just some sort of idea that you can't have 3 words of the same. These are such minor differences. Well, it's not a scribal error. And I don't, there are occasional scribal errors, but we're not calling them scribal errors. They are rather, we call this we call this the fluidity of the text. Different scribes had a different tradition as to what the text said. Let me say a word about that. This is not just true of the Torah. This is not just true of the biblical books. This is not just true of the Jewish tradition. If you go back to the Middle Ages, as we'll do in the next 2 weeks, every text that was ever created in Greek, in Latin, in Arabic, every single text is unique. There is no such thing as a standardized text. Hebrew, Greek, Latin, you name it. Not until the age of printing did the printers have to decide, I'm going to run off. I'm being serious now. I'm going to make 300 copies at once. I'm going to have to set the type. It's going to have to be this, and all those 300 copies are going to be it. And so the variants fall by the wayside. The textual fluidity comes to an end. So there is this should be noted. And to this day, there are Yemenite Torah scrolls have 8 different places, have 8 minor differences from the scroll used by Sfardim and Ashkenazim. It still hasn't disappeared totally. They're very minor. It doesn't change much. They're very minor. But
so fluidity mattered with texts, and I imagine with alphabets, but maybe a little less. Vis-a-vis the position of letters, we saw a little fluidity, and that changes over time. How about the sof, the final letters? The last question in the chat asked about when they were developed, and how does that come together?
Good. Thanks for mentioning that. The great question. So the 22 letters don't have final forms. When I showed you the 22 letters early on, those are the final. They don't have final forms. With the adoption of the Aramaic style newer Jewish script, we do get final forms. And if you think about them, not the mem, but the other four final forms are all written, the regular forms rather, are all written with a horizontal line on the bottom. Kaf, Nun, Pei, and Sadi all have a horizontal line. So in final position, the scribes didn't go with the horizontal line. They just continued it down vertically, giving it a tail at the bottom. And that just has to do with scribal whimsy almost, and it becomes standardized. Let me give you an example. The Y at the end of my name, Gary. When I write out my name, Gary, that Y at the end has a much bigger and longer loop than if I'm writing out the word yes, where the Y is connected to the E. Is that making sense, everybody, right? These just sort of become the little things that I notice, because this is the world I inhabit, on how we write things and so on and so forth.
Nice, really nice.
Yeah.
Really nice. Anybody have another question? Mark, did you have one before?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up, Professor, on the issue of scribal transmission. I'm assuming that the creation and dissemination of written text was fairly limited and scarce. How important was oral teaching and transmission of the substance of those written texts? How did they get passed down in between writing them down on parchments?
Great question, Mark. Okay. Every text in antiquity, again, Jewish/Hebrew or otherwise, every text in antiquity was passed down in writing and orally. It was a dual transmission. There were very few written copies. You know what it takes to write out the entire book of Genesis? You know, getting papyrus, getting ink, the man hours, or later on parchment. By the way, I didn't mention this. Sorry, I forgot to include this. The wonder of parchment was, it was all local. Everybody had a goat. You didn't have to import it from Egypt. I implied that, but I didn't say it explicitly. And of course, since we live in the year 2023, it was local and organic. I mean, it came from your own goats. Okay. So the every text was transmitted. So you only had X number of written copies, but people knew how to recite a text. And when you go into synagogue today, I invite you, I do this, I invite you not to open the Chumash at the reading of Torah. Sit there and listen, because that is how it happened in antiquity. That is how it happened through the Middle Ages. That is how it happened probably through the early modern period. Do you think everybody in a synagogue 500 years ago had a printed book to sit there and listen? Recreate what I call the oral effect of reading. Oral from the mouth, reading into the ear. A-O-R-A-L-A-U-R-A-L. It's hard to say those words differently, oral and oral. From the mouth into the ear. That's the way literature, including the Torah, was transmitted for most of Jewish history. And only recently do we actually sit there with a printed book. I do not. Now, I have facility in Hebrew. If it's Genesis, I know the text. I don't know the description of the sacrifices in Leviticus, but I can listen to it. And if you have a good reader of Torah, Scott, you'll remember Jonathan Ehrlich. He's still doing it. He's just so phenomenal in Highland Park. We are blessed with one of the best.
Wow.
And you can just listen to him and learn. And so that is how things happen. There might have been one copy for 20 or 30 people. And if I'm going to read Genesis to you, I'm going to have to get that copy. And like in a group of our size, this is the way it was done. Thank you for that comment, Dale Stern. 40 years ago in Turkey, there were no books in the women's section. Well, I'm sorry that they were so non-egalitarian that they couldn't have some books in the women's section, but that's a good example of what I'm talking about.
They expected the women knew Hebrew, I guess.
Oh, the women knew the text by heart, right? Good. Okay, let me just say the following. It's worth mentioning this. Great trivia question. Where's the first time the word writing appears in the Torah? First time you have the root katav, to write in the Torah. It's in the story of Amalek in Exodus chapter 17. And God says to Moses, the Israelites have just defeated Amalek. And God says to Moses, Ketov zot zikaron b'sefer, v'sim ba'oznei Yehoshua. Write this down in a book, meaning a scroll, a memorial scroll, and put it into the ears of Joshua. Now, we all know what the first part means. What does the second part mean? Put it into the ears of Joshua. V'sim ba'oznei Yehoshua. You have to write out the text, and you have to orally teach it to Joshua, who represents the next generation. Because 2 to 3 or 4 generations from now, the written text will still be there. But when you have Aleph Shin, is it Aish, fire, or is it Ish, man? When you have Aleph Daled Mem, is it Adam, man, or Adom, red? So you have to also teach it orally to the next generation, and people passed it down orally, relying on the written text, which was a skeleton of a text with really just the consonants and no vowels. Does that help answer the question?
That's really great. What an amazing place. I think that that's a wonderful place to end today's installment. Isn't Dr. Rendsburg incredible? Wisdom and refreshing, and what innovation to think through the ideas of how the scrolls we feel are precious really got their start from the world of ancient technologies and craftsmanship of humanity towards the sacred notion that they have. It really is kadosh.
Oh, thank you.
And we look forward to 2 more lectures with you over the next days. Join us either here at the OZ Beit Midrash, the library, or from wherever you are as you have this morning. I will wish you really great, wonderful travels where you are now to cap off whatever the Israel visits you made and got visits to. I hope you have another little artifact from Provence or somewhere near to add to the collection here of slides. But what a magnificent group of images edition this morning. And thank you so much for sharing and beginning us on this series. Thank you, Mark, for introducing the lecture series in the newsletter. Take a look at the newsletter front page to make sure you've got Times Square, everyone. And I'm going to wish everyone an early Chodesh Tov. We just blessed the new month of Shvat with a wonderful rendition of Tu B'Shvat Higia, in at least the tune in the prayer for the new month that Mark used. In addition to his wonderful Torah reading, we have some amazing Torah readers here, Gary. So when you come to the city for Shabbat, you'll be able to also leave your book in the pew and just experience the oral effect. But Rosh Chodesh services are 7:15 a.m. tomorrow morning, and we need you to help make the minyan if you can make it, so we can sing Hallel from the printed Sidur or from memory, whichever way you want to go. Shavua Tov and Chodesh Tov. Yishar Koach.
Thank you, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you. See you next week.
Rabbi, it's interesting, you went to some, they're finished, right? They're finished, right?
So long, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you for an outstanding program.
Yishar Koach again. Gary will speak. Thank you again, Dr. Rendsburg.